And welcome to part 17, following the restoration of our 2-foot narrow gauge locomotive Fowler 16341. A little bit of industrial archaeology to kick us off. The lamp on the front of the locomotive is quite distinctive. You see the row of 4 holes in an arch and the bracket down the bottom, the clasp, and quite a distinctive shape. That was the works photograph from 1924, and you can see it matches the original 1924 works drawings as well. It was an acetylene lamp, and there's an acetylene generator in the cab, which was calcium carbide with water that mixed to create acetylene gas. There's another lamp on the back there that you can just see the feed for. The lamps were long gone, having been replaced at Tully Sugar Mills in the early years of the loco's service, so I took to the internet to see if I could track down some lamps of the same design. There were lots of lamps on there, all brass, all from the right period, with similar sort of shapes, but none of them were quite what I felt that the works drawings and the works photograph showed, until this pair turned up after about 2 years worth of searching. This is an aluminium pair that turned up at a Bewley car auction, and when I requested a second photo from the side, we saw the arch of the holes and the general shape looked very, very promising. So we bid on them at the auction, and considering that all the other lamps we'd seen were about £500 each, £130 for the pair seemed a very good result. This is a close-up zooming in on the lamp, and here's Dave holding our new lamps when they arrived in the same orientation. You can see we've definitely got the right lamp that was fitted to the locomotive in 1924, the right design. Although they've clearly been languishing in the back of somebody's shed for the last 50 years, they're actually in really good condition. And we think they're incredibly rare lamps. They have an A and an L in a star shape on the top. And I've searched the internet to try and find other lamps, and I've only found one other set of lamps with that design and branding, even though they were half this size, for sale in Australia. So I think that they're an incredibly rare set of lamps that I can't find any more information about. So if anybody knows, it would be great, let us know. But here's Dave polishing them up. They've all been polished by hand. We had to replace the glass in one of them because it was cracked, and when we took the brass wire out that retains it, the glass just fell apart. But here's the pair looking all shiny and new. It's a bit cold in the workshop on this day, so you can see the condensation from Mark's hands on the lamps, but they're beautifully polished, and they will look absolutely superb on the front and back of the loco, and we'll be able to put it back into pretty much as delivered condition in 1924. As you can see, it opens. We're not actually going to have them as acetylene powered. We're going to sneakily put a lamp in there and run in some electric wires so that they can run off a battery. Just a little bit more simple and less clutter in the cab. Originality and the restoration of original parts is really important to us here at the Steam Workshop, so it was a very satisfying part of the restoration, that. So back to the valve gear. This is the slide bar. It's a long bar of steel that supports the crosshead and allows it to slide backwards and forwards, guiding the piston down the centre of the cylinder backwards and forwards. Looking in plan view from the top, you can see the shape of it. That's the crosshead on the top that I'm pointing out. We had the original, and Dave gave it a light clean up and polish up so that it was ready to go back on the locomotive with minimal fuss. But the right hand side of the locomotive, the slide bar was completely missing, so we needed to make a brand new one. This is the Bundaberg drawings, and a Bundaberg locomotive is essentially, as we've talked about before, a straight copy of the Fowler. So this is the Bundaberg drawing for the slide bar. You can see the shape in profile there, and then if you look closer at the side view of it, you can see it starts off relatively thin, gets fatter for the bit that supports the slide bar moving backwards and forwards, and then thin again at the other end. So brand new piece of steel here mounted on the Bridgeport, and you can see we're starting to skim away some of the material to effectively carve out the shape of the slide bar. The slide bar to be is mounted here on its side in the Bridgeport milling machine, and our Bridgeport actually hasn't got a long enough stroke to be able to do the whole slide bar in one go, so we're doing each side individually. You can see the markings here that we're about to machine away, and underneath you can see where we've previously machined the bottom side already, and then flipped over to do the top face. You can see again that the Bridgeport isn't quite long enough on its bed to do the whole sweep in one go, so you can see we're machining halfway along, and then Neil will reposition it on the milling machine and do the other side as well. Really, this particular item, the slide bar, is a little bit big for the machines that we have here, because we're a model engineering workshop used to dealing with miniature locomotives rather than full size. But you know, we can still manage it. We just have to take it a little bit slower and use a little bit of initiative as how we use the machines. Here we're sort of semi-boring out the curve from the thin section at the front that we saw on the drawing to the fat section that supports the actual wear of the slide bar going backwards and forwards. And the last operation for manufacturing the shape, thinning down the end of the slide bar, the section that doesn't support the crosshead but fastens to the rear cylinder cover. So a slightly abridged process, but after the final passes were done on the slide bar, it looked really rather good, very nice and beautifully finished by Neil there in our workshop. The finished rod was then case hardened. Now that's a process where you heat the rod to quite high temperatures in a carbon or nitrogen rich environment, in our case carbon, and you can see that that carbon gets infused into the surface, hardening it, and that's why it's this black colour. The shiny part has been ground back to get it to be the exact to the thou dimensions for the slide bar, but it still retains that hardness. So it should be a very strong and resistant to wear item. Moving on to the valve rod. This is the rod that operates the valve backwards and forwards in the cylinders. Now, this is the drawing for it. This is again the Bundaberg drawing, as we didn't have the Fowler drawing for it, and there are subtle differences which I'll come to later. We had the original Fowler rod. Again, the left-hand side of the locomotive was more or less complete. The right-hand side was missing several components. This is Dave doing a rough clean-up of the rusty left-hand original Fowler rod. When we checked it, we found that it was slightly bent. You can see here on the dial gauge, it's bouncing all over the place as we rotate it in the lathe. The rod needed straightening before we machined it to make sure that everything was in line. So here you see the rod on a rotating press jig. There's a large press above it here, and as we rotate it, we were able to bend that rod square. And then after that process was done, we could then machine it to get the final finish on it, knowing that everything was in line. The right-hand side of the loco is a different story. This is looking down from the top at the valve rod that was fastened to our locomotive, but original to a Bundaberg locomotive. You can see in the accident that smashed that cylinder, it's all bent and would be completely unsalvageable. So this is a brand new one that we've made from scratch in the workshop, and you can see that Neil is just machining the far end down. Now, although we made a new rod, we actually rescued the original end. We chopped it off, we machined a recess into it, and we machined a peg on the new rod, and we put them together and welded it together and finished off that. So that's the original end on the new rod. This is surface grinding. So this is the process where the rod is then being surface ground to the thou to give it a really smooth, beautiful, polished finish. This is actually the new rod with the Bundaberg end on it. That is the original bent Bundaberg rod, which has had its end chopped off, and that's the new Bundaberg rod, and you can see the original end is on there. The thread pitch on both was slightly different. So the thread pitch on the Bundaberg, slightly coarser thread than the original Fowler one above it. The guide diameters on the end are slightly different as well, thinner on the Bundaberg than it was on the Fowler, but ultimately we'd like to try and swap them back. So they'll work on our engine, but we've made it to the Bundaberg so that it can go back on the original loco if needs be. The missing valve gear. So we have a combination lever. The red one is the original Fowler. We have a lifting link, which is this next one here, which is the link that lifts the valve gear from forward into reverse. And then we have a foundation link, which is here, the original one as well. This is the link that goes on the bottom of the combination lever to the bottom of the crosshead. And you can see underneath them is basic water jet cut shapes out for the creation of the new bits of the valve gear. So we're going to start with the lifting link. Here it is. The reverser, when you pull it forwards and backwards, lifts that link up and down, which moves the die block and the valve rod up and down in the expansion link, in that kind of arc, which changes it from forward gear to reverse gear. There's the arc prescribed in the expansion link that we saw in a previous video. This is the again the Bundaberg drawing, because that's the only drawings that we have of this level of detail, but again ostensibly the same as it would be on the Fowler. The basic water jet profiles were actually really good, and had we known how good they were going to be, we'd have probably made them more accurate to the finished sizes, so that we'd have to take less material off on the milling machine. But nevertheless, you can see here the operation to create that curve I just traced on the original Fowler item with my finger. It's just a careful job of going through, machining everything to the right sizes, taking off the 2 or 3 millimeters that we left on there from the water jet size, and then finishing the surface off to be a good finish. You can see here Neil's just skimming the sides down, and then here we've got the original placed on top, clamped on top of the next one, the new one, so that we can drill through and get the holes in exactly the same place, and open up and skim up the holes on the original one as well, so that they can both take new pins. Having located the position of the second hole, we were able to punch it, centre drill it here, and then drill it out to the right size. And then ultimately, as you'll see in the next clip after this, we put a big reamer through to ream the hole out to the exact size that we'd want to fit the brand new pins. New pins are going to be made for all of this. We've made them slightly oversized, and some are going to have new bearing surfaces in, but all certainly going to have brand new pins. The foundation link is ostensibly the same process that you've just seen with the lifting link. This is here, this is the raw blank sitting there, and then skipped a few processes. You can see the end has been rounded off, which is here happening to the lifting link, but you can see the finished foundation link in the foreground on the top. Basically roughed out to its finished sizes. It needs surface finishing there, but basically that's the finished rod, and you can see the process to round off the ends there. So moving on now to the combination lever. This is the bigger rod that you saw of the 3 rods that were missing. There's 2 combination rods on either side, and they're the vertical leaning slightly back here on the works photograph rod. They combine the motion of the valve with the motion of the crosshead to give you the correct opening of the valve ports. You may have noticed on the Bundaberg drawing there, it's referred to as the vibration lever. I've never understood that, and without wishing to start a Facebook comment section fight, I've always thought that's a very strange name for it. It's a combination lever. It combines that valve movement with the crosshead, and that makes much more sense for naming a lever as far as I'm concerned. But here we go. This is the new rod at the back and the old original Fowler rod in the foreground. We had 3 of them, so we had a pair for the Fowler side, and we had one for the Bundaberg side, which we think is a Bundaberg one, but it's so close to the Fowler that we can't actually be sure it's not an original Fowler. So again, just going through some of the processes on the milling machine to machine up the rough water jet cut blank into the finished shape. Here you can see the rod being squared up against it, having done most of the machining but still haven't rounded off the edges and still haven't bored through the new pinholes. Here a little bit more advanced, the ends are now rounded and Neil's finishing off the side. The rod is actually slightly tapered, so this is not in flat, it's in at a slight angle, and Neil's taking a few skims off to taper it and thin it at this bottom end. It's fatter at the top end, I believe. That really is the last part of the missing valve gear. Everything else existed or has already been restored, and we've put some of that up on videos already. The only thing left is the crosshead. We're going to make new piston rods and pistons, but that's to do with the cylinders. But valve gear wise, just the crosshead, and then we'll have a complete set ready to go back on. So this is the finished rods. They're not going to be beautifully finished like the crosshead, like the slide bar was, because these are going to be painted red. But they'll be neatened up a little bit before the paint, and you'll not be able to tell the difference between them and the originals, hopefully. Thanks for watching.